The St. Charles County Veterans Museum is a 501c3 nonprofit business. The museum would not exist without the donations of our generous community. Your donations ensure the museum continues to share and preserve the stories of our veterans. Would you like to be part of something special? To donate, visit sccvetsmuseum.org and click on Donate. The Dog Tag Podcast may at times cover sensitive topics including, but not limited to, suicide, abuse, violence, severe mental illness, sex, drugs, and alcohol addiction. You are advised to refrain from watching or listening to the Dog Tag Podcast if you are likely to be offended or adversely impacted by any of these topics. Neither the company, host, director, or guests shall at any time be liable for the content covered, causing offense, distress, or other reaction. The information, opinions, and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only. The primary purpose of the Dog Tag Podcast is to educate. The views, information, or opinions expressed on the Dog Tag Podcast are solely the views of the individuals or guests involved and by no means represent absolute facts. The Dog Tag does not accept responsibility for their views or comments. Welcome to the Dog Tag Podcast at the Mid-America Veterans Museum with your host, Jason Galvin. Today in studio, our guests are Marcia and Jim Higgins, curator and historian. Thank you so much for joining our show. We're back in the studio again. Thanks so much to Marcia and Jim for coming tonight to talk about just a couple stories here that they have been a part of and overall what their roles have been and stories that have been written in the museum. Tonight, we're going to be talking about, stories and how they often evolve. Just to talk a little bit about our guest, Marcia, she is our curator at the museum, and Jim is our historian. Jim has been with the museum in every role before the museum opened, and Marcia became the curator when our first curator was abruptly quit right before we opened, just a couple weeks before we opened, actually. Together, they have a comprehensive working knowledge of every story in the museum. They also manage the process from start to finish. The stories that are published on our website, they take care of. They do all of that work. And if a story comes in and includes artifacts, they often will be exhibited. The museum is always looking for more stories to add to our collection. And with that being said, welcome, Marcia and Jim. Thank you so much for joining the podcast here. And we'll just start with a question about one of our stories that have been in the museum for a while now, and that is the story of Joseph McNamee, who was a World War II Marine. And Marcia, this is a story that was written about the time we opened back in 2019. Yet there were several revisions to the story a couple of years ago and most recently in June. Would you be able to share how this story came into the museum and kind of how it has evolved?
Well, in a way, the story of Joseph McNamee and the exhibition of his Purple Heart is a story of the mission of the museum. It's the story of what we do and why we do it. The Purple Heart was part of the collection that had already been donated when I came on board. It had actually been given to Mayor Pagano of St. Peters, Missouri. Some people were clearing out someone's home after a death, and they didn't know anything about the family, didn't know what to do with it, so they gave it to him, and he held on to it for, I guess, quite some time. And when he learned about the opening of the museum, he brought it to us and said, do something with this so that this person is remembered and honored. At the time, Jim has turned into be a wonderful historian, a real bird dog of finding out facts and straightening out all sorts of stories. At the time, he didn't have a whole lot of resources at his disposal, and he did a small search, a quick search, and found, that he didn't see any living relatives of this man, Joseph McNamee. However, we thought it was important that this man be named and honored, and so we proudly exhibited it in our museum. And then, little by little, we started to learn a little bit more about the man. And Jim, do you want to take it from there?
Sure, thank you. What was interesting about it is if you do any research of any kind, what you run into eventually is kind of a roadblock. And, every once in a while you just need to put a story down because your mind is getting mixed up and you're trying to figure out, is there anything else? And sometimes you just need a fresh take at it in the morning, a week later, a month later. And with Joe McNamee, I quickly discovered, and I still haven't quite figured out whether Ancestry, the website, wasn't nearly as up-to-date as it is now, or I missed it. But I think it was a combination. But I didn't see relatives of Joe McNamee, who happens to be a Mayflower descendant, by the way.
Oh, wow.
And so in doing a little bit of research, I kind of put it down. And as I always do, I feel like you need to revisit every story. You're right. And take another look at it at a later date. And something prompted me to take a look at Joe's story. He was a Marine. He served, we know, in the Pacific, as the Marines did. And I thought there should be more. And I guess I got lucky because I found a series of newspaper articles. And it was kind of a strange story in a way, because the article that I found it concerned Amelia Earhart. Now, right away, I'm fascinated. I found a newspaper article saying they're searching for Amelia Earhart, and they found something to do with Joe McNamee. It gets you intrigued. And so it was a 1964 newspaper report. The rumor is that Amelia Earhart actually crashed very near or on Saipan, before World War II, and the Japanese imprisoned her and the gentleman that she was flying with, and executed her, and she was buried on Saipan. Well, some West Coast reporters decided that they were going to visit Saipan and actually talk to some of the local residents, missionaries, and different people, and see if they could uncover anything to this story. Well, they land there, and they meet with the missionary, and the missionary is going to help them find the place where supposedly, Amelia's grave was. And out of the jungle comes a native carrying a box, old cardboard box tied shut with a string. Apparently had been in his possession a very long time. And he knew that this was a very precious object, and he handed it to the missionary, who handed it to the reporters. And what they found inside was a bronze memorial etched, engraved, and it pretty much was a grave marker for Joe McNamee, who died on Saipan on July 9th, 1944, in the battle. Ironically, the day that the island was deemed secure, he was killed. And obviously they didn't find Amelia Earhart, or there would have been some news, and they wouldn't be still looking today. But these West Coast reporters were just in awe about this, and they thought it was a very special gift. They reached out to the Marine Corps, and the Marine Corps they said, well, the mother's still alive. Joe's mother's still alive. We give you her address, and you go visit her and present that to her. And so they made an appointment, KMOX radio, local radio here in St. Louis, and these reporters actually did, an AP, Associated Press, actually visited the mother and presented this to her. She knew about this and took it. And she made a remark like, well, I think what I'm going to do with this is we have a memorial marker, that is Joe's name on it at Calvary Cemetery here in St. Louis, and I'll actually put that on his marker. So I thought that was the end of my story.
The soldiers that died on Saipan were repatriated. Their graves were, their bodies were exhumed, and they were repatriated to the United States. And obviously, this little marker somehow did not come out of the ground with Joe McNamee's remains. His remains are now interred in the Punch Bowl in the National Cemetery of the Pacific in Hawaii. And so somehow or another, this brass marker was left in the jungle. And when the farmer who had found it was plowing his field, it turned up, and that's why it was in his possession and why it didn't get returned to the United States back in like 1948-49 when the military started repatriating all these remains.
So, by and large, they presented this to the mother, and she said, "I'm going to put it there in the cemetery." And she somewhat knew about this thing, but we didn't get any more information than that. And I thought, well, okay, now I've updated Joe's story, and I'll go reach out to Calvary Cemetery in St. Louis. I'll go up there, maybe make a visit, and I'll see this marker, take a picture of it, and there's a fitting end to the story. Well, when I reach out to Calvary Cemetery, they say, "Oh, no. Anything left on a grave, we collect it after about 30 days, and we throw it away, bury it, and get rid of it." And once again, here I am. I thought, well, this is the end of this story again, and I'm not gonna be able to do any more. So once again, I put down that story. I did update it. We had a book about the search for Amelia Earhart actually on display with Joe's Purple Heart and Holy Card. So time passes a little bit, and it was December the 16th of 2023. I actually got a phone call. Ann Kenny from New Orleans, and she was a Dorothy, I believe her mother's name was Dorothy.
She was Joe's brother.
She was Joe's brother.
Joe was her brother.
Joe was her brother, and she said, my son was having a party, and he wanted to know if we had a punch bowl. And I knew my mother, I was in my deceased mother's home, and I knew she had a punch bowl someplace. And I was up in the attic, searching through the attic for that punch bowl. And I came up on an American flag that was all folded up and realized it was my Uncle Joe's.
Was in a cardboard box with his name on it. And that's what made her think about, gee, I wonder what I can find out about Uncle Joe.
So Ann decides to Google Joe McNamee, her uncle, Uncle Joe. And, of course, if you Google Uncle Joe or just Joe McNamee right now, very quickly the search engines come up with the museum's website and Joe's story. And she was shocked, a little bit flabbergasted, she would later explain to us, because they had no idea. They knew they didn't have some of the medals and some of his things, but here she finds out that it's in our museum here in St. Charles, Missouri, or Fallon, Missouri. And so she reaches out and makes a phone call, and I happened to, I talked to her. I said, Ann, that's wonderful. We titled this exhibit The Homeless Purple Heart to begin with, because ideally with a Purple Heart, they shouldn't be bartered, they shouldn't be traded, they shouldn't be sold. They should be with the family of the fallen. And I said, of course, Ann, we would be glad to return this Purple Heart to your family, and you could have it in the family. She goes, let me talk to the family, and we'll make some arrangements. And I said, all I ask is, that you guys consider picking it up. I don't want to mail it. I just pick it up, and we'd be glad to return it to the family, and we'll still keep Joe's story alive here. That's what we do. So a couple weeks pass, and I get another phone call from a gentleman in Nebraska. I believe his name was Tom. And Tom said, you got a Purple Heart of my Uncle Joe in the museum there. I said, well, yes, Tom, we do. He said, I live in Nebraska, and every once in a while we get to St. Louis area, and I'd like to come in and pick it up. I said, well, Tom, that's what we want. We want to repatriate these medals. We want them with the family. And I didn't think anything more of it. I figured Ann and Tom had talked. Both were relatives of Joe. So another week or so passes, and Ann calls me back and said, Jim, effectively, she said, we don't think that Purple Heart is homeless. We think it's found a wonderful home there in your museum where everybody can see and hear the story of my Uncle Joe. We want you to keep it. And I was moved by that, and to a degree, she's right, because we honor him, we keep his story alive. Everybody that comes to the museum, whether it's Marcia, me, or many of the other volunteers, we tell Joe's story. It just gets better and better. I said, but Ann, I have to kind of mention one thing. I guess you and Tom had talked, and Tom called me, and he wanted the Purple Heart. She says, I don't know who Tom is. I said, you and Tom didn't talk? No. By coincidence, they both happened to see our website, Story of Joe McNamee, 2 weeks apart.
Wow.
Without talking to each other. And she said, I'll tell you what, we want you to have it, and I think we're the closest living relative, and it's our decision. So let me reach out to Tom and tell him what the family has decided. And then she started to say another couple of things that were just fascinating to, I think, Marcia and me both. She said, by the way, that grave marker that was found by the missionaries on the missionary native on Saipan, we have that.
Wow. So
it made its way. Marcia, go ahead and tell how.
That's, this whole thing is it's just serendipity. The entire 5-year saga of this one little Purple Heart. She knew that it had at one time been in the family, that it didn't get disposed of at Calvary Cemetery. Possibly it never went there. And she asked around, and it turned out that, and this part we didn't put all of this in the story, but it had been in the possession of her brother, who at one time lived in the St. Louis area. And he had a rather unamicable divorce from his wife. And when she asked him about it, he said, "Oh yeah, I don't know. I left. He left all of his stuff. He left and never claimed any of his belongings." So Anne called the ex-wife, who happens to still live in the same house, and happened to not have disposed of any of her brother's things.
Wow. And
she said, "Let me go take a look." And she finds it in a drawer upstairs, and and gets it to Anne, and this has been just. They wouldn't have even asked if it hadn't been for the story that they saw online, and Anne finding the flag that had been draped over his coffin when he was repatriated, and looking on the website. And so, like I said, just serendipity all the way around. What are the chances of any of this happening, and what are the chances of all of it happening?
Exactly.
And so we made arrangements to spend D-Day just this past June at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. And Ann Kinney lives just across the lake in Mandeville. So we arranged to meet her and her husband, and they were an absolutely delightful couple. We talked for nearly 2 hours about her brother and about all of this happening. And she presented us with the brass plaque, and it is now displayed proudly in our museum. They still have relatives. They still have family who live in the St. Louis area. And so we can't wait for any of them to come and visit us. And Anne and her husband, Tom, are planning a trip back up here to St. Louis to see that too, and we're looking forward to showing them around and honoring Uncle Joe.
Absolutely. Jim, you and I were having lunch last week, and you talked to me a little bit about this story on a high-level basis, and you mentioned that a little bit about how that plaque actually got to Saipan to begin with. Can you talk a little bit about how it ended up there to begin with before repatriation and those kind of things?
That's a great question, Jason. I'm glad you asked that, because there was still a few mysteries with this story that we hadn't figured out. Number one is, just by looking at the plaque, the first time I saw it, it was, originally we thought it was something crudely engraved. And we knew that somebody loved Joe very much to create this marker and leave it on his temporary grave on Saipan. And yet it found its way home. So we're trying to figure that out. And the Kinneys, Ann and Tom, and they had her son Ben with them too. And we were kind of brainstorming this and said, well, who could it have been? And there was a subtle mention of an uncle that maybe did this. And then we reasoned out that James McNamee, James Patrick McNamee.
No, it was Joseph Michael. It was his uncle.
It was Joe McNamee's uncle was in the Navy.
Yeah, whose name also happened to be Joe.
And they were cruising in. He served on one specific ship, and he happened to be in the South Pacific, very short period of time in the Philippines around that area. And of course, on a ship, you'd have the ability with a tool room to be able to kind of craft something like that. And we believe that that's where that came from. And he actually left it there. But we also discovered more interesting things about Joseph McNamee, Uncle Joe. And Uncle Joe owned a family-friendly bar in St. Louis on 25th and St. Louis Avenue. And so I did a Google search on that, and I went to the Missouri History Museum and a couple places trying to find out. I'd love to come up with some authentic pictures of the bar back then, but I found the building's actually still standing. It was built in 1897. It looks vacant, but Joe owned that building. And when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, the next day, like many young men, he immediately signed up for the Marines, and he left the bar, the management of the bar, to his brother to manage the bar while he went away to the war. And that didn't work out real well, obviously, but, McNamee Bar, or we believe it was probably called McNamee's Bar or Pub or something like that, or Saloon. And we actually found a picture of that, so it's all this story has been updated, and we've still got to update the overall story. But Joe had, he had a tough go of it. I mean, he is a true American hero from a couple perspectives. He was on Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal was a very tough battle. He wasn't with the 1st Marine Division. He was with the 2nd. They didn't, have the same experience as the 1st Marines, but they still had it pretty tough. And he was on Tarawa. The 2nd Marines landed on Tarawa. And that was a very, very tough battle. And, of course, Saipan was just, it was just horrific, the battle. And the irony that Joe was killed in action on the day that the island was deemed secure is just another irony.
And he was actually wounded on Tarawa.
He was wounded on
And
Tarawa.
Jim believes that this is probably the Purple Heart that he received for that wound. And another little piece of family lore is that he never told his parents that he had been wounded. He was recovered and went back to action, and his parents didn't find out that he was wounded until the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. At that time they combed all of the reports, and for news of any local boys, and they found it and published it, and that's how his parents found out that he had been wounded on Tarawa.
Oh wow. When you guys mentioned he was wounded, and then, of course, he lost his life, but did he have multiple? Do we know if he had multiple Purple Hearts, one for the first wound and then the one for being killed in action?
Yeah, generally speaking, if you're killed in action, you're awarded a Purple Heart. And I believe that the Purple Heart we got, it says for gallantry and bravery on the back, and most of them were engraved with names on them, and most of them were engraved with names on them. And, of course, the one where he was killed in action, my belief is they awarded it to the family. It probably is around someplace. but I'm not sure where it is. So kind of hard to say.
Turning 65 or new to Medicare? Joe Rumbolo's Medicare Made Easy works hard for our veterans. Did you know you may be eligible to enroll in a Medicare plan and keep your VA health, drug, Champ VA, and TRICARE for Life benefits? We offer a range of different plans from a large number of top-rated carriers. We can find a plan that will best suit your needs. A Medicare Advantage plan specifically designed for veterans and spouses who are entitled to VA health benefits, Champ VA, or TRICARE for Life, may offer extra benefits to you that you may not otherwise receive, like dental, hearing, and vision coverage, over-the-counter products allowances every quarter, one-way trip transportation to the doctors, Part B premium give back, fitness programs, personal emergency response system. Please contact Joe Rumbolo today at 314-753-0792 for any of your Medicare needs. And Jim, thanks so much for giving us a little background on that Purple Heart and kind of the backstory of how that marker got to Saipan. I think it'd be important, we don't want to leave this out of, how stories can get lost and then what we do to preserve them here at the museum. And, as a generation goes by, as a veteran passes, the stories do get lost. What do we do? How do we at the museum, how do you and Marcia collect these stories, write these stories, preserve these stories, and things of that nature? If you can just give us some feedback on that, you and Marcia.
That's a great question, Jason. There's a optimum way to learn about a veteran is to meet family members. This is Marcia called this serendipitous, but if you don't have a family member, you're really limited to, if you want to honor a veteran, you're really limited to, he was born on this day, he lived on this block, his occupation was, and it's very generic, high-level stuff. When you can meet a family member, if there's memories and things like that, you can usually build in quite a bit of information. Same goes for, generic information. If you know what unit somebody served in, you can make an assumption that if he was with D Company and D Company was in the European theater right outside of Paris, you can kind of assume that was his experience. But it's impersonal information. So that's what's kind of sad about it. It really, you have to be really proactive at trying to save the veteran's history. And we like to say in here that one generation passes without preserving that story. It's gone. If we wouldn't have met Ann Kenny and Van wasn't around, what would we get about Joe? It would have been gone because it's just that stuff's not written down anymore. We do like it. We try to record stories. Modern veterans, it's a little different story. When they come in, we can do a podcast. We can do our Veterans History Project and do an interview. We have kids interview the veteran, and we can preserve that. But when you're talking about the older veterans, you are very limited to what you can find out about them online. Seldom will you find enough detail in books, unit books, squadrons, different books on the units to really talk about their specific time.
And yet, there have been quite a few instances when Jim has been researching. If he's got what was called a DD-214, which is from the military, and it's a list of where a veteran served. Occasionally, he can start looking, and he can find that a book has been written about it. And lo and behold, sometimes he'll read those books and find mention of that veteran in the book. And so it's by hook or by crook when we hear these things. Very often we are anxious to get the story out, even if it's in an incomplete state, because what seems to happen is we publish the stories, and sometimes very, very quickly we are contacted by someone in the family that we didn't know about. It's really hard when, for instance, someone dies. He died before he got married. He died before he had children. Maybe he had 5 or 6 sisters, and maybe they all got married, and maybe they all have different names. It's the trail ends, and so we're delighted when someone contacts us. Sometimes they contact us and say, "Well, oh my God, you've got that all wrong," and that makes us happy. Bring it on. Tell me what we got wrong. I want to tell the story, and we want to tell it right. And that has happened time and time again. The other thing that sometimes happens is we had a gentleman. He was another Marine. It died on. Did he die on Saipan? Bruce Maxson. No. He was taken prisoner after the Battle of Corregidor. And he died in a Japanese prison camp. We published his story. And not long after that, we were contacted by someone who is working with a group overseas who is still discovering remains. And they contacted Jim and wanted to be put in touch with the family and see if they would donate a DNA sample. And so because we published this short story about Richard Maxson, his remains might be repatriated to the United States, totally serendipitous.
So what I'm hearing you say is it's important to get the story posted and see what happens.
Exactly.
That's exactly true. I mean, we can't do justice to a story without some input from the family. Obviously, you keep the person's name alive and you do publish what you know. And we do that to honor them. But when a family member does see that, reaches out to us, we can really do so much more to remember the veteran, and it becomes a very special story. Marcia was talking about there's a veteran that I thought this was kind of an interesting thing, and it's kind of strange how this happens. One time, a gentleman by the name of Ronald Weidman came in. He called me up on the phone and said, "I'd like to get together, and I'd like to tell you about my brother, Elvin." And I said, "Sure, Ron." He said, "I work kind of funny hours. It'd probably have to be a Saturday." And I said, "That's fine." He said, "I just want to make sure my brother's remembered." And so we ended up, I think, we ended up with a date of November 9th. This is 2022. And he comes in, and I always ask for a little preliminary information. When was he born? When did he die? Well, Elvin died in Vietnam. He was with the 5/7th, the Air Cav, and Sky Troopers, they called them back then. They were still learning how to fight in Vietnam. This was early in the Vietnam War. They'd helicopter people in and search and destroy, and body counts. That was the main strategy there. Well, Elvin was in Vietnam for about 4 months, and his company was actually given directions, and they were supposed to meet up, and they actually were given wrong directions, and they wandered into a very heavy bunkered area where the North Vietnamese was very well fortified bunker system. Well, Elvin approached the first bunker of North Vietnamese soldiers, threw a grenade in, and killed them. Then he moved up to the next bunker with his rifle. He took out that next bunker. And then he approached the third bunker. He's doing this single-handedly, and he actually was throwing a grenade in when he was mortally wounded. He ended up dying then. Ironically, the date of that was November the 9th, I think it was 1966.
Wow.
So his brother was in on the anniversary of the day he was killed in action. And he said, I've been trying for many years to get that upgraded. He was awarded Distinguished Service Cross, so I think it's second only to the Congressional Medal of Honor. And he's trying to get it upgraded to the Congressional Medal of Honor, which is a very, very difficult process. And, of course, I reached out to local Josh Holly and his office, and they said the same thing. And I don't know if it'll ever happen, but, so I said, Ron, I'd be glad to bring your brother's story into the museum. I said, let me do a little digging, and I'll get you a draft copy in a week or two. And you never know what you're going to find. First of all, I can't understand how anybody did research before there was the internet, number one. I don't know how you did it. I guess you drove a lot of miles and flew a lot of miles. But I found that there was a book written about the very company that Elvin served in the whole time he was in Vietnam. I knew where Elvin was at on a daily basis. And I reached out to the author of the book who gave me permission to use the information. And, I could use pictures and everything, which was awesome. And he said, by the way, I'd like to talk to Ron because I'm updating the book. The book is called On the Ground They Stand On. The joke kind of was, I call it a joke, it's not a joke, but the only ground you owned in Vietnam is what you were immediately standing on, and the moment you left it, you didn't own it anymore. And but it was a great story, and we were able to put together a day-by-day story about his brother who was, killed, gallantly died in Vietnam. And from my perspective here at the museum, you never know what's going to walk in. And you just, when you start digging around, we can really, truly tell a really special story about people very often. And I've found 6, 7, 8, 10, 12 times there's been books wrote about, some of the people in the museums. And it's neat when you can reach out and get that kind of information. It's chronicled so well.
That's incredible that you could get day-by-day information from a book. And was that guy embedded with them? How did he have the knowledge of the company and things of that?
Well, it turns out it was his uncle.
Okay.
That was in the same company, and he came back, and together they wrote the book about their days in Vietnam.
Okay. So first-hand account then.
First-hand account of he knew when Elvin was killed, and they were in different platoons in the same company, but very good accounting of Elvin's action on that day and the days leading up to his death.
Well, you mentioned that you guys were able to go down to Louisiana, just backtracking a little bit, and retrieve this grave marker, this plaque that was laid in Saipan. We talk about at the museum that it's not about the stuff, it's about the stories, right? But in this particular case, and in a lot of cases, this artifact, this stuff, enhanced the story of what we can share with others over a period of time. And I think that it makes it more human, and I think it gives credence to the fact that, those that we always talk about are never forgotten, right? Their stories are told, or they're never forgotten. Well, this was a many of people involved in maintaining this person's story, and now we have it all the way from Saipan to St. Charles County.
What's kind of special also is the artifacts. We use the artifacts to help tell the story of the veteran, but if someone would just walk past this exhibit and see this little brass plaque, they might not give it a second look. Oh yeah, here's a Purple Heart, yeah, there's a picture, and there's this thing. But when I tell them what it means, when I tell them the story, that's when the fascination comes in. Very often, a lot of times I say, I don't want anything anonymous. You'll find very, very few things in this museum that don't have a story attached to it, don't have a face, a name. And this is a prime example of that. You could probably take this. In fact, Ann and Tom thought about this. They live in New Orleans, and they've been to the National World War II Museum many times. They thought about donating it there, but the chances are between slim and none that it would ever actually get exhibited. That's why the walls in the halls of this little museum are just chock full of stuff, because it's important to everyone. I don't want it to be, oh, you're not important enough, we're not going to put that out. If it helps to tell the story of the veteran, that's why it's there. It does no one any good. This was part of our founder, Ralph Borelli's dream, was, I want those things. I don't want them down in the basement in a cardboard box next to the water heater, because once, like Jim said, one more generation is gone, nobody's even going to know who it belonged to. So bring it up out of the basement. Don't let it sit in a drawer. Bring it to us and let us show everyone the loved one and their bravery and their contribution to our freedom.
Well, how do you guys gather the information? What what resources do you use to gather information, to write stories, to get to update stories, and how long does it take to do the research and write the stories?
Another good question, Jason. It kind of depends on how the story comes to us. It's been hard for us since we opened, 5 years ago to become really proactive at kind of garnering stories and bringing them into museums. We do that to a degree. We keep track and we can post something in hopes that we can later embellish it and tell more about them. But, when a story walks in the door, somebody comes in, they'll bring us a uniform and an artifact. They'll say, this is my Uncle Tom's, this is my husband's. We kind of, the first thing instinctively out of our mouth is, this is good, but do you have a picture of him? Can you tell us about him? Because we won't exhibit anything without knowing their story, because our primary mission is to honor those veterans. And so they might have a little bit, and then we try to enhance it a great deal. You can find out a lot about a person. An example is what squadron were they in, what unit were they in, and that's tricky, because let's face it, the Army and the Armed Forces, their record keeping wasn't, top shelf. It was crazy, and you gotta fact check on a regular basis. But, we Ancestry, Fold 3, a lot of places like that, newspapers.com, and it depends on the time, to be able to kind of pick up everything you can. But, it's a lot of fact checking and a lot of listening to the veterans. Their personal memories is often a tip where to kind of head. And honestly, as far as how much time does it take to complete a story, I've got as little as 6 or 7 hours in a few stories. I've got as many as 80 to 90 to 100 hours in other stories. You find out new information. They were transferred to a squadron. An example, Mel Sucharipa, Mel Surrey, he was part of the Forgotten 500, and his wife couldn't figure out where he was. He was reported missing. Well, late after he was rescued, and I think at a next podcast we might tell his story a little bit more. He was actually when he was going to be transferred back to the United States, he was actually transferred to get him home. He was transferred to another squadron. So if, as a researcher, you're looking at that squadron and trying to figure out his history, you're not finding his name coming up. And very often, the Army in World War II, they would transfer you to different units just to make space or get you on a boat coming home. And that's tricky because their history isn't with that. So you really do have to dig at it, and you got to pretty much be unrelenting, dog on it, bone kind of a thing to fact check constantly when you're doing the history. And I don't know if I, frankly, will ever get to the point where I feel 100% positive of any story I've ever written. I get to the point where I'm 99%. And I think, hence, that's kind of the reason that I go back and check, I think, from time to time on every story. I actually have a list that hangs over my head in the office here, 35, 40 people I don't have a picture of them. And that frustrates me more than anything else here at the museum, that I can't come up with a picture of these people. Now, God knows, I would think you join the service, they take your picture out routinely.
Yeah, they'd have to.
But
you don't know if they did or not, though.
You talk to the Army, and we don't have anything like that. So it's working with the Army is a challenge. The Record Center is a challenge. So you just kind of hope that eventually you find a crack in that wall and able to kind of slip in and grab some more information. But it is a very, very long process often.
And it sounds like, from what you're saying, is that no story is ever 100% done, where, like we mentioned at the beginning, it could evolve at any time based on new information, new stories. How many stories, Jim, do we have currently available at the museum for people to uncover?
We have, we're pretty close to 600 stories now. We, in the 5 years we actually published, good year, we'll publish 120, 150 stories a year. We've got a little help helping us now, and we're trying to capture. We're trying to be proactive at capturing stories a little bit more often and uploading them to the website. Pearl Harbor. We're working on one particular project right now. McBride High School seems to have. It's interesting about World War II, when it happened to World War II, but McBride High School has a strange number of all men. They happen to be all men that served and were killed while serving. It's just a huge number, and it seems disproportionate to any high school that I've ever heard of, and we're actually trying to understand that, track that down, and certainly honor the men that were killed while serving. So that's what I mean by proactive, and eventually, and it might be a 2-3 year project, we'll upload those stories to the website too.
That sounds like it could be a great movie, just telling that story. Marcia, as curator, we have a lot of stories in the galleries and a lot of artifacts. Do we have a number of how many stories are actually being displayed in the galleries at this time?
I think we have between 275 and 300 separate exhibits. And we do have some stories that do not have exhibits displayed on book racks. But very quickly, that started to get a little bit unwieldy. So very often now, when we have stories without artifacts, or if it's just a story, we publish it online and we don't put it in the museum. Part of the challenge as a curator is choosing. I have a responsibility to the donors, the people who are entrusting the stories of their loved ones with us. But I also have a responsibility to our visitors. And in top of mind is, how can I display this in a way that would be interesting to our visitors? For instance, you ask any curator of any museum, and they will tell you that they display less than 5% of their entire collection. We're probably more like 15, maybe 20%. However, if I displayed every uniform that has been donated to us, this place wouldn't be very interesting. It would look like the Gap. And I don't think that it would be attract many visitors to come in and just look at uniform after uniform after uniform. What makes all of these artifacts special is the story behind them. Most of the things we have came from the milkman, a teacher, the guy that fixed air conditioners. We don't have, I use this as an example all the time, we don't have Patton's pocket watch. Now somebody walks in with that, I might be okay accepting that. But then again, we could probably write a hell of a story about George Patton anyway, So it's a responsibility that I take very seriously in honoring what is given to us, and at the same time making sure that this museum is something that people want to come to again and again. Very often people walk in the door and they kind of don't want to make eye contact and they just want to go look around. And if I'm here, a lot of times I'll hang back and I'll kind of see where they're hovering, what section of the museum seems to interest them. And then I'll see an opportunity and I can walk up and I can say, let me tell you a little bit about this here. And I can tell them a story. These stories are epic. They're, like I said, they're common guys. They're PFCs, maybe a sergeant, maybe a corporal. We don't have a lot of really glorious soldiers, and warriors that are famous. They're just ordinary people that stood up and answered the call. And when I tell them an epic story, then they want to know more. And I don't know how many trips to the museum it would take for me to tell all the stories that we have, but I'd love to try.
I would think that the more stories people hear, the more they would want to hear. I think when I first walked in here, I was overwhelmed just by the sheer being in awe of everything. And I grew up military, I'm a Gold Star family member, so I kind of have a little bit of the background of what sacrifice looked like and things like that. And you say we don't have these big glorious ones, but to me personally, they're all epic and glorious. And the reason why is it's the guy like Matt Sims, that's not an average guy. You know what I mean? That's one of my favorite stories. He's been on the podcast, and to me, that is epic. You know, I mean, I think every one of these stories could have a movie written about them, but we all have our favorite stories. There's a lot of them here.
Let me offer this too.
Sure.
I like to say this whenever we're talking about veteran stories. Most of the veterans that come in here, virtually all of them, are very humble, and they say real quickly, I didn't do anything special. And I really try to correct them and say, you served in the military, you made a sacrifice, and there's things that you did that other people will find interesting. We got Bob Rosinski, who was on guard at an air base in Korea during the Korean War. Darkened air base one night, and out of the darkness walks a group of people, and he's on guard duty, and he's scared. He's 19, 20 years old, and he challenges him, says, halt or I'll shoot. Exactly what he's supposed to do. A couple seconds go by, and he hears, shoot hell, we'll shoot you. And this goes back and forth, who's going to shoot who for a few seconds. And out of the darkness walks Dwight Eisenhower, then president-elect, who was visiting the South Korean president. He walks right up to Bob Rosinski and says, Bob, would you really have shot me? He says, damn right, sir. I was scared and I didn't know who you were and you didn't answer my challenge question, right? And the point I'm trying to make is everybody has a few stories that should be preserved. They're interesting and the public here would love to read them. Bob passed a while back, but in subsequent years in his life, whenever he met anybody, he'd quickly shake your hand and say, hi, I'm Bob Rosinski. I almost shot Eisenhower. It's kind of a standard opening introduction to somebody. So all veterans have great stories, and all stories should be preserved, not only for them, but for their future generations.
Yep. And you've said before, you never know what's going to walk through the door, and you never know what story is going to come in, what story with an artifact is going to come in. What would you guys like to leave us with as we end the podcast? Whatever you guys would like to speak about as historian and curator of what the stories mean, what you mean by anything can walk through the door and such.
I think it's important to, when you're talking about, all of us have an uncle, a grandfather, a great-grandfather that served, and we're going to get around to it someday. And I hear that all the time, and years pass, and I hear that the kids aren't interested in the stories, and I hear that kids are not interested in genealogy, and I think that might be somewhat true. But the older you get in life, the more you reflect on, I wish I knew more about this. I wish I would have asked about this. And we said it earlier, a generation passes and it's gone. And it's like a gold mine that you can't go in anymore. And all the information is there while the people are around. And we have a tendency to wait till it's too late. And I do think that future generations, it will become important, and someone will be curious to know more about their grandfather when they served. And putting it off, procrastinating, is just a bad thing, because it's memories fade, and it's important. The museum can help you with that. We've got people here, and it is our plan to preserve the stories. And if you call the museum sometime and say, I'd like a little help with this story, we can give you direction. We know where the resources are at to reach out to them. We can certainly take a look at what information you got and turn it into a story. It takes some time, but, there's no time like the present to do these things.
And I appreciate that, Jim. Is there any specific way that the listener, if they wanted to get in contact with somebody here at the museum, how they would do that?
The best way to do that is just call the museum here, 636-294-2657, and tell them you're interested in bringing a story into the museum. And what we always ask for is a picture of the veteran, obviously birth dates, and if they're deceased, the day they died. Those get you started pretty quick where they grew up. You may have some information about them. You may have limited information about them, but sharing what you know with one of our team members here kind of gets us off, and we're able to get going on the story.
Thank you, Jim. Marcia, do you have anything else before we end the show tonight?
Maybe just to encourage everyone to come check us out. We're open Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. if you haven't been here, if you don't know what to expect, just come. If you walk in the door, I think you'll understand what we're talking about. And I think you'll be inspired, even if you don't have anyone in your family who was in the military, even if you know nothing about the histories of the wars. Come and let us share some of this with you, and then you can go home and tell your neighbors, because we're here, we're open, and we love to share what we know, and we love to share our stories.
Thank you so much, Marcia. And just so everybody knows, the museum is in O'Fallon, Missouri, on 410 East Elm Street. It is the Mid-America Veterans Museum, formerly the St. Charles County Veterans Museum. And you'll hear the tag at the end of this podcast on, if you like this podcast, if you love the museum, you can donate directly to the museum. But we would love for you to stop by and embrace the stories, embrace the history, and just share in the evolution of all the stories here in the museum. Well, that's going to do it for us here tonight at the Mid-America Veterans Museum. This has been your host, Jason Galvin. Thank you so much, and have a good night. The dog tag is brought to you by the St. Charles County Veterans Museum. The museum is a 501c3 nonprofit business. Do you like our podcast? With your support, we'll continue to bring you great programming. If you'd like to donate, go to sccvetsmuseum.org and click on Donate.